Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It is 11 o'clock in the West, 2 o'clock in the East, and today we are going to be talking about the new CIRCIA reporting requirement. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We still have a lot of people coming into the room. This is an issue that, has piqued a lot of people's interest. We have a ton of people signed up today. And so we really appreciate everybody being here. My name is Jake Milstein. I host the events for Critical Insight. The two organizations we have on the call today are Critical Insight, the protect and defend critical infrastructure organizations against cyber attack. And Davis Wright Tremaine is also here, and we'll introduce Michael Borgia in a second. But they're law firm based here in Seattle, and we do a lot of work with them, and they do great work in cybersecurity and a bunch of other places. Wow, look at all of the people coming in the room. All right, well, let's get going here. Okay. So joining the panel today, I already talked about Mike Borgia. Mike runs cybersecurity practice at Davis Wright Tremaine. He is really terrific to work with, and we love having him on our webinars. Brings a legal perspective to these kind of things, and he's been great if you've seen him before. And so, Mike, that means that you're going to have to be great again today. Also joining us, Fred Langston and Mike Hamilton founded Critical Insight. Fred is currently our Chief Product Officer, and Fred has done years and years of consulting in critical infrastructure. A lot of organizations that he's done consulting or done consulting with affected by this. And Mike Hamilton, former CISO of the city of Seattle. So thank you for joining us. Folks are already saying hi in the chat. So over on the right is the chat. A couple of quick things. Number one, there's a little bell at the top if the chat is dinging and you want it not to ding, or you want it to ding. Hit that button and it will ding or not. Also, people always ask, are you going to get a recording of this? Yes, the system will send you a recording, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. So it's YouTube, just look on YouTube for Critical Insight, and it'll be there. Also, I'll put a link to the deck, and we'll send out the deck later to folks who want it. All right, and with that, one more thing about chat. I forgot this. If you guys have questions, comments as we go, put them in the chat. And I love interjecting and interrupting Mike and Fred and Mike Borgia with questions. So Mike, now take it away.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jake. So let's dig into this. Let me just say that when this first came out, it was actually some time ago. So signed into law back in 2022. And if you will remember the event at the time, right before that, 2021, was Colonial Pipeline. And what we found out was that the sector-specific regulatory agency that has purview over pipelines is the TSA. And the TSA hadn't provided any guidance to pipeline operators at all. And so there began this big push to get those SSRAs, sector-specific regulatory agencies, all in line to do the rulemaking required to get everybody the kind of requirements that they need to protect critical infrastructure. There's a large ecosystem around this. All of the critical sectors have government coordinating councils, sector coordinating councils. Most have an ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And they are able to create sector-specific plans for their sector. For a while, that kind of fell off. I was actually part of the state, local, tribal, and territorial government coordinating council, and these are the things that we worked on. So all of these regulatory agencies that have the purview over the critical sectors have been telling, and we'll see this in a minute, saying you're required to report these things to us. And now there's so many of them that CIRCIA here, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, is trying to harmonize all of this stuff. So what we're in right now is called the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking period, where you can comment on these things. And as we go through this, we're going to talk about a lot of the uncertainties that are still here and how you may want to get involved in making the comments so that you don't have something land on you that's going to be really hard to manage. So the specifics. So notice of proposed rulemaking was published April 4th, and they're going to keep the comment period open until June 4th. And that's kind of a long time for a comment period. The final rule will not be published until 2025, and they want to give a lot of time to be able to go through how are we going to implement this. And one of the things that's really in question still is the enforcement. The two key requirements that are embedded in here are about the 24 hours to report if you've made a ransomware repayment payment, and then 72 hours to report a covered incident. And so the definitions of what is a covered entity and a covered incident are still a little fuzzy and maybe overly broad in some places. And our attorney friend here is probably going to pick that apart quite a bit when we get to it.
Yeah, and I do want to say, like, I know ahead of this, I got a bunch of questions about that from some cities and from a hospital. We're going to dig into that. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. So if you go to the Federal Register and you read the 447 pages, first of all, don't do that. But if you do, here's some of the government speak that we can pull out of there. So why do they want to do this? What are the purposes? Well, we need to know what foreign governments and criminal organizations are doing, and if there is a systemic pattern that we can tease out of that to better prepare ourselves. We need visibility across a very wide breadth of organizations in the United States to be able to identify things with some statistical relevance. The definitions of the things that they want reported are exactly what you would think would come out of government speak, right? So likely to result in demonstrable harm to national security. Identify and disseminate ways to prevent or mitigate similar incidents in the future. So what this is, in part, is a big data gathering expedition so that we have this telemetry across the United States. We can see patterns start to emerge. We can find places that are particularly bad at one control or another, for example, vulnerability management, and help to get in front of that. And in fact, one of the things that's embedded in here, not the parts that sucked all the air out of the room, the mandatory reporting, part of this is an early notification system, which has already been in pilot. And so something like 600 organizations have been warned about you're being targeted for ransomware, you have a vulnerability that's being exploited by ransomware folks, et cetera, et cetera. And it's actually starting to take shape now. And again, that's in pilot, but that's going to be operationalized very quickly.
And wait, can you go back? Because I want to ask Mike Borsha
Sure.
a question here. So there's something in here that I think is just so broad, which is public confidence. I mean, anything can impact public confidence, Mike Borsha. Like, I mean, a protest can impact public confidence. So, I mean, do you see that? I mean, how does one determine what impacts public confidence?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I think that the rules themselves are, and we'll talk about like what's a substantial cyber incident, are a little more tailored, although we'll talk about how broad they are. Yeah, so, and I kind of see this more as a statement of purpose. This is what they want to capture these types of incidents. But I agree, you couldn't, if this were the definition, there'd be no way for you to determine it. How can you as an entity say, like, or even like, this could hurt the broader economy? Like, I don't know that. I mean, a few entities might be able to say that, but most can't. So I think that for most entities, just be looking at the definitions and kind of letting the regulators figure out these broader purposes. What I do think is interesting here is, like, this kind of reminds me back of the CISA, the Act, the Cyber Information Sharing Act of like 2015, right? And everyone said at the time, like, oh, I don't know if I want to share things with the government. I'm worried about that. And it was, no, it's a good idea. We can get all this information sharing. I think a tension here is that people still rightfully feel like the promise being made here has never really been returned. Like, people share information with the governments, with state and federal governments and others, and then they don't really get back actionable information. And that's a tension one we may talk about here, but I think it's a tension that comes up in every new reporting requirement where the government says we need to know in 72 hours, 36 hours, 24 hours, 2 hours, whatever it is. And the question always gets asked, why? Why that fast? Well, because we need to get information and act on it and share it, but then that never comes out. And I think that's a very common and fair source of frustration. So, I am a fan of CIRCIA. I do think they've done some great things, and I'm interested to see if they're attuned to that. And if they say, look, if we're going to start requiring this, we're going to have to up our game in sharing information back out too, so people see the benefits of this regime.
Right. Along with that early warning, right? They're going to gobble up this information, and if they can use that information to tell you specifically, hey, we think you're being targeted or something's about to occur. Right? I get that. That's valuable. But going back to public confidence, if the words after public confidence are in the outcome of an election, I really believe that's the embedded message here. I really do. And you'll see from some of the other language where they're talking about election infrastructure, and if you're a company that provides that, you're in scope. So
I wanted to make a quick comment on the federal partners, because a lot of people, and we heard, Jake and I heard this from a field officer from CISA last week back in Kansas City. Federal partners, in fact, are not the FBI or the law enforcement agencies. It's like FEMA, emergency management agencies, NIST, all of these other agencies you probably wouldn't expect, but they're not specifically talking about sharing information with FBI so they come storming in the door or something like that.
Yeah.
And I do think, and Fred, you may have a sense of this, but there's a question in the chat about, well, wait, so if you have, let's say you get hit by ransomware, who do you report to? Like, will your insurance company report to CISA and the FBI? Is it your responsibility? David says, why not just report to fusion centers and then have them report it to CISA?
Which is a great question. That is a great question.
Really, why not just report to CISA, and then you could tell them these are the entities we're regulated by. So if you'd like to notify the FDIC of this or HHS, go ahead and do it. Right? We don't have to notify 6 different regulators, but everyone wants to. They want to be included. They want to be in the room.
But if you call your insurance company, do they report it? Do they ever? One of the things that Fred and I heard last week is that there are a couple of insurance companies that say, hey, don't tell the federal government. And the FBI was like, no, that's a mistake. Tell us. But I've heard 2 things. I've heard, number one, the insurance companies, some of them don't want you to tell the federal government. And that in some cases they will actually help you report to the federal government. Mike Borgia, from a legal perspective, what do you see there?
So your insurer should not be reporting the incident. That would be weird. I guess they could, but they shouldn't be doing that. It's confidential. And if you look at these rules and other rules, they're about, if you're a covered entity, they're about incidents that you are experiencing. So they should not be doing that. There were some iterations of this law, and there were a million proposals to get this done. And one of them had like broader notification obligations for incident response companies and things like that. But that has not gotten into this. So it's the entity itself that would have to report. Regarding law enforcement, if your insurer tells you that you cannot report this to the federal government, I'd have some really serious questions about that. And because one, look, that's your decision. That's not your insurer's decision. It should not be. And you should not sign a policy that says we get to decide if you go to the police or not, right? Or law enforcement. That's very strange. Secondly, if you're going to pay a ransom, there is guidance from the federal government that says that if you inadvertently pay a sanctioned party, they will treat it as mitigation if you have reported the incident and or the payment to the federal government. You've been open about the fact that it happened. So, do not let your insurer. I've never heard that. I've always had insurers. And in fact, the insurers I've worked with have all said you should report this because we want the mitigation too. We don't want to be funding an illegal payment. So we think you should report it because if you take our $1 million and pay a ransom with it, we want to know that like the proper mitigation has been taken just in case the recipient is sanctioned.
All right. Mike, why don't you keep us going? And I do want to call out another Michael Nixon's comment in the chat because it made me laugh, which is, who does CISA have to notify when they get breached? Yeah.
They call me. Okay, moving on.
Go ahead.
So here are the purposes, examples of these purposes, right? So the preceding paragraphs were, kind of lifted from the Federal Register, so, gov speak. But if you boil this down, hey, we want telemetry across the country so that we can mitigate vulnerabilities when we see that you have something that is under active exploit, help you mitigate these things, get those early warnings out there, be in your corner for actual boots on the ground response. All this is embedded in those 447 pages. Disrupting threat actors. And this leans into a whole bunch of things that the federal government has been doing. There's the federal cybersecurity strategy. The DoD is defending forward. The DOJ is apprehending, prosecuting, and otherwise melting criminal infrastructures. The software bill of materials, the IoT labeling scheme. The federal government has really leaned into trying to get arms around this problem, realizing that there's a lot of public harm done by these acts, yet it's private responsibility to make them not happen. And so somewhere the government and the private sector and the mostly private sector operators of critical infrastructure are going to have to get together on this stuff and work as a team. So, that's the underlying theme to me. The reason for doing this, the reasons for doing this, all good. Implementing this, TBD. I think it's interesting too that they want to use data for research. And so, we talk a lot today about whether or not we're going to use some generative AI that trains itself on my data and, makes that information available to other organizations, members of the public, whoever. I'd have the same kind of argument here. You're going to use stuff that happened to me in research. I don't have any control over that. So some of this is interesting, and I think, subject to the comment period.
Well,
Okay.
so hang on a second. So, when you think about that data for research, there's a lot of times where, one of the things that they want to do is to say, okay, it looks like a new threat group. It looks like a new gang or a new strain of ransomware. Isn't that right? A new tactic, whatever. Isn't that something you want them to do? That's a good idea, right?
Yeah, there are going to be lots of organizations that are a little more, they play their cards very close. And if you are in some sector where you're doing some kind of innovation and you have a lot of intellectual property involved in that, I don't think you want to be used in that kind of research. I'm just saying there's going to be, I'm sure, organizations that push back on that point.
Yeah. Mike Borsha, what do you think there?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's funny. It's been like a few years since I've had a client that, in principle, isn't fine with sharing threat intelligence information with the government, right? Like, clients generally, they want to help the cause. They want to catch the bad guys. They're happy to say, here's some IOCs we found. We obviously want to be seen as being cooperative. We love being able to tell our customers or clients we're, cooperating with the FBI or others. And so, I don't really see pushback on that. I don't really see pushback on the idea that it should be done kind of quickly. But what I do see pushback on is, things like this, like, could we be putting our own information at risk? Are we, we're in the middle of trying to stop an incident and we're being told we need to provide like reams of information to the federal government so they can like chew on it and come back to us in 6 months, and that's where people get frustrated. So I think you will see some pushback on this, even though I think that the core requirement, I think most people agree that the idea of providing some quick uptime, this is what we're seeing. These are the IP addresses. These are the tactics, helping the cause. Almost everyone, I think, is fine with that, to some core degree.
All right, Mike, why don't you do the English here, and then I have another question here.
Just to summarize in really distilled terms, CISA needs telemetry across a very broad swath of organizations to get statistical relevance to the things that they say, right? If there's a new tactic emerging, one observation is statistical fuzz, means nothing. But we start seeing that pop up all over the place, or we start seeing systemic problems in, for example, local governments don't get their remote access tools in good shape with respect to controls. Right? They could find something out like that. That would be very useful. So trends, threats, and then early warning to notify, hey, this threat group is going after this, exploiting this vulnerability that was announced yesterday. Do you have the patch? Apply it now. That's great. That's all good stuff. And there's been, I personally know organizations that have been helped that way. All right. So that's what they're doing. All right. So the sector-specific regulatory agencies, and some of these are not actually SSRAs. Some of these are just federal agencies. This is a smattering. This is not even half of them that have some kind of mandatory reporting already in place. So the objective here is to try and consolidate all of this down to a single methodology and a single data collection point where we're all playing off the same sheet of music. We all know what we're supposed to report. We know what the reporting mechanism is. We know what's supposed to be included in the report, and it's all aggregated so that we can expose that to some data analytics and start to tease out the information that we want. So, right, FDA talks about medical device regulations. Department of Energy has very clear guidance in what are called the NERC SIPs, right? In fact, there it's down there, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards have been in place for quite a while. So this is not new information to all of these agencies. The methodology that's going to be employed is going to change subject to what comes back in the comment period and some of the things that are probably going to fall off of this. Okay, so let's talk about who is.
Hang on.
Yep.
So going back here. So, one of the things, and Mike Borgia here, like we have seen all sorts of different reporting requirements, different number of hours, different number of days. We have 48 hours for some. Even just if you're a credit union or you're a bank, you have different reporting requirements.
Right.
So does this change that? Like when this rule comes out, everything now goes to the CIRCIA rule, or you still also have different numbers of hours to report for different sectors?
Well, we don't totally know, but I think the likely answer is they'll be different. So one of the goals of CIRCIA was harmonization. And there's a cyber incident reporting council that was created as part of DHS that has issued a report back last year about the proliferation of these requirements. And there is a mechanism, what they call it, CIRCIA agreements in the regulations, the proposed regulations, that in theory, we don't have a lot of detail on this. In theory, what should happen is that agencies will have similar requirements about reporting, content, and timing, and they'll make agreements and they'll say compliance with one is compliance with the other, right? That'd be great. How much is that going to happen, right? I don't know. Or is it going to say, oh, well, as long as you're complying with the tighter one, I don't know. So we will see. I think there's a good chance here that, it's like there's an effort to harmonize the standards, and now there's just another standard instead. And it's going to continue to be a challenge to meet all of these. And you can see there are a lot of companies that are on a number of these, right? Like that do, maybe they're defense contractors. They also do FedRAMP, and they're in, any number of other areas here. And so they've got to comply with 3 or 4 of these, and it's quite complicated.
And yeah, and if you're an organization that, touches a whole bunch of these, you have to the whole idea here was that you would have one reporting requirement, not, 7 for 7 different things. And so, do you, Mike Borgia, see this as something where they'll actually be able to get that done, or the federal government is continue to be a little dysfunctional here and have different ones? Do you think they're going to harmonize?
Some will get done and others won't. So there will just be outliers, and that's just how the government is. There's some people that play ball and some agencies that play ball well, and some that are like, no, we're very special, and we're going to continue to be very special. Back to my earlier point too, again, I don't really see clients reject this idea of there should be some kind of short-ish deadline where we report that we've been attacked or something. Like that makes sense. But what's really frustrating is you're in the very beginning part of this crisis. You're trying to sort things out. And rather than focusing on the incident, you're like, well, wait, is this the 24 or the 72? Or if we do that, but then this information is a little bit different, and you're just figuring out paperwork rather than solving the incident. And that's really frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, especially, somebody up top in the comments pointed out, my experience is you get to share and explain the same information 14 different times.
Yeah.
That's super fun when you're in the middle of battling ransomware terrorists in your organization. And Fred, in terms of what is reasonable, I know one of the things that you have done for many, many years is help organizations build incident response plans. And in those incident response plans, like, how do you know that there's a bad guy in your system? How many, so how many hours is reasonable? Because we've seen a patchwork here
How many hours for
reporting.
For reporting? Well, so here's what I would suggest: is take all of these standards, find the full set that includes every reporting requirement. In other words, the most restrictive set of requirements you can build. Unify these things, build a process that can answer every one of those questions. Hopefully, the goal here is that you're going to report in one singular fashion and be able to piece off the chunks of it that this agency wants. I want this part. I want this part. So I think the key to this is the approach you take is to take an all-encompassing approach, make sure you're answering all the questions, and you have a very robust reporting structure to handle this quickly. It should be as automated as possible to meet what you were asking, Jake, the time frames. So having this machine that you've built, if you will, to report on incidents that has all the correct inputs, can do it rapidly and answer all the questions that you may get asked is the only real way you can approach this.
All right.
I'll answer that partially too. It's going to depend on how well instrumented your network is and how you're able to detect and determine, get the information that they want reported. And, if you've got one IAT, what's in question, there's a lot of questions in my mind about local government, right? Because they do water and waste processing and traffic management and communications for law enforcement, all that stuff. And all those are individual critical sectors. Local government is in the worst position possible to be able to afford the kind of instrumentation that would let you meet these requirements. So, I think it's going to depend on how big you are and kind of the resourcing that you've put into this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll just point out as something happening right now, the Change Healthcare breach, happened in February, and it has taken them until now
Exactly.
to admit that there might be some patient information. Like, really? I mean, it's months for something that seemed, maybe obvious early on. It's my opinion, but I mean, I think, and that's a multi-billion-dollar, well-resourced organization.
It was just yesterday that they told us it was the Citrix vulnerability that was the initial avenue of attack. Yesterday, right? You'd think that was something they could probably have told us at least halfway back to when it first happened. But
now, what we don't know, and I don't represent them, so I mean, just saying,
Good.
I have no horse in this race. I'm just pointing out we don't know what they've told the FBI or CIRCIA or others like early on, right? And that's a different consideration. And I mentioned that here because it's important that like what you're saying to CIRCIA in response to these rules when they come online, or what you're saying to the FBI, could be very different level of detail than what you're going to say publicly. And you're thinking about a totally different set of deadlines, and that may be okay. That may be the right thing to do. And who knows? I mean, maybe what's happened here is they've got as often is the case, I think a lot of cases I've done with a third-party vulnerability, you get to a point where you're like, well, probably, but we're never going to totally know. And so we're just gotten to a point, I think we've sort of exhausted all their possibilities. And so by process of elimination, we think it's this vulnerability. And so maybe that's taken them a while. I have no idea, but, just keep that in mind that it could, these are very different deadlines speaking to regulators.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fair. And I'm glad you brought that up. And I want everybody to know that it would have been didn't know whether Mike Borgia was working on the Change Healthcare thing. And it would have been really awkward if he had just said, actually, I'm representing them. So I'm glad that it turns out that he's not.
Okay, moving on. So here are the critical sectors. And these are all defined in Presidential Policy Directive 21, which was from 2004. I don't even know. Where this concept of the critical sectors was defined, and the ecosystem around these sector-specific agencies, the government coordinating councils, etc. So you can see it's dams, water, finance, energy, information technology. When they said that CIRCIA is now in its comment period and it's likely to affect around 300,000 U.S. organizations, that's what got my attention. Because they're pulling in a whole lot of organizations that I think are on the periphery of these things. And some of them, like local government, that cuts across them. So again, I asked the local government question from their the email address that they give you for questions and answers. I said, look, is it going to be a single agency? Is it just the water utility, public utilities, or is it the local government? Some of that language would confirm that it is the local government because you have these pieces that are critical infrastructure. But when they emailed me back, they said, we're in the comment period. We can't really say. So I think a lot of this really is TBD.
Well, and we'll get into with the definitions, but there's not a clear definition in law of like what it means to be in these sectors. So like if you're a dam, I mean, I guess that makes sense. You're in dams, right? But like what makes you in the information technology sector or in the communication sector? Again, there are going to be some that are like, we're a bank, so we're financial services, okay. But there's a lot of other entities that or not. What if you're like a non-bank lender? You're provide software that supports banks. I don't know. There's not.
You're a debt consolidator.
Existing framework we have in this policy directive just lists a bunch of sectors. It doesn't say in this sector is defined as this. And so overall, I think they put a lot of thought into the rules and they were pretty precise. But I think we'll talk about this more. It's going to be a huge gap right now, because I don't totally know how to tell a client if they're in one of these sectors other than like, I don't know, it seems like you kind of do stuff that's related to that sector, but that's not a very satisfying legal analysis.
But I mean, in terms of that legal analysis, so if, there's going to be penalties for not, and somebody is on the bubble of like, hey, you may be part of this and you may not be, like, what is your legal advice? Yes, there's risk and you probably should, or what, how do you give them that? How do you help them determine that legal risk?
Yeah, well, I know we'll probably get more into penalties as well because everyone's interested in that. I mean, I think that's probably right, that it's better to assume you are without sort of expressly saying you are and be safe. On the other hand, there's a number of things that worry me about these regulations, but I've never said this before, but this is true. The penalties are not one. It's weird, but just because of how limited that regime is, it's like the only way you really get in trouble is if CISA comes to you and says you should have reported that, and then you still ignore them, right? So I think that counsels for an approach that is, conservative, but doesn't need to be excessively conservative, because if you get it wrong, there's actually not a huge consequence as long as you're getting it wrong in a good faith way.
Right. And, and Fred, I know you've talked to a lot of organizations, that are obviously critical infrastructure, right? Like an energy organization, or a utility, obviously. But, for organizations that are sort of on that bubble, like, an organization that, supports the energy industry or something like that. Do they see themselves as critical infrastructure? And how closely do you think they'll be looking at this?
I don't think they do, but I think the prudent thing for critical infrastructure to do is pass that down to them contractually, that they need to report in the same time frames if they have a breach that the potential entity that's within a critical infrastructure vertical. So I would say if I am covered, I'm going to make sure whoever my third parties are, especially if it's key for me to deliver my critical service, that they are contractually bound for the same requirements.
Yep. That makes sense.
All right. I got to keep us moving here, people.
Keep going.
Okay. All right. So this is the money quote I was talking about here, right? The rulemaking process will also establish a broader definition for covered entities. The proposed rule would define covered entity as the entire organization, even if one part meets the criteria, right? So this is some of the the kind of round off error that I think the ongoing discussion, the comment period, is going to be really good for. So regardless of which part of your organization suffered an impact, your organization is the one that's going to have to report. So, my mind always goes to local governments. And so here's public utilities, they are impacted by something. And then the city is the one that's going to have to do that reporting. There is a very interesting piece in here where they're talking about the criteria now for you being included and as a covered entity. Does the organization meet one or more enumerated sector-based criteria? And there was a criterion in there that said there must be a sector-specific plan that applies to you. That's what comes out of this big ecosystem of Homeland Security critical infrastructure protection. And not all pieces of critical infrastructure have a sector-specific plan. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. And then there's a size requirement there as well. So, do you exceed the small business size? So again, some of this is a little spongy. So here's my example from government facilities. So some of this is pretty straightforward. So any state, local, tribal, or territorial government entity for 50,000 or more residents. It can scoop up schools, educational, and again, there's a size threshold there, a student population of 1,000 or more. And then here is the interesting thing I saw embedded in here. Any entity that manufactures, sells, or provides managed services specifically to support election processes. So that's where, when they say, public confidence, I think this is what they're talking about, public confidence in the outcome of an election. So if you are, a voting machine manufacturing company and you have some kind of incident, yeah, dude, you don't really fall in one of those critical sectors. However, you better report this because that could be a big loss of public confidence right there.
And and by the way, because I see some of the folks in the audience, match this profile. What if you are a managed service provider working for a county that's managing elections?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you then an entity that's providing managed services, used to support election processes? Maybe.
Yes. Well, I mean, depending on what the final rule looks like, maybe. So this was an interesting thing in there. So if you go through the Federal Register and this really, really long piece of text in there, there is, for every one of the critical sectors, there is a statement like this. And so you can find exactly where you fall in and see what it says about you. What is a reportable incident? Okay, now we're getting into definitions here, right? Who's covered? What's a reportable incident? Again, it's kind of, the things that you would think. So loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, right? Go back to your CISSP handbook. Disruption on the ability to engage in business continuity, right? Just especially if there is could be an impact of public health or cause of loss of life. Disclosure or unauthorized access to personally identifiable information, and then disruption to other critical infrastructure systems or assets. So this is the cascading failure, the downstream effect, things like that. Hey, because our dam operation was impacted, there is going to be energy impact to that, right? So this is kind of the definitions of reportable incidents. And again, this came from the Cyber Incident Reporting Council that was created. When was this created, Michael? It's a while back.
Yeah, 2022.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is things that came out of that council that are being used as the definitions in here, at least during the comment period. All right. So what has to be reported? Well, you have to describe the events. So what was impacted, whether process information, and I don't know why this was in there, created by the intelligence community is impacted. So I'm sure in defense industrial base, okay, that's going to be something, okay. Unauthorized access with substantial loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Disruption of business or industrial operations, because critical manufacturing is a critical sector too. Then they want you to describe the vulnerabilities, security defenses, and TTPs. So what vulnerability was exploited? Was it the Avanti product that you should have patched 6 months ago? Probably. What type of attack was it? Was it, actor in the middle interception of multi-factor authentication credentials? So they want all the details that you can give them about this. And here's where it starts getting into, you might need to have some forensic capability, or at least your insurance company coming in and providing forensic capability in order for you to be that detailed with this reporting. And somehow those two timelines are not going to coexist well. The time it takes to figure some of these things out, Change Healthcare, is not going to be met in 72 hours. They want you to the extent possible, anything that you can report that would help identify the perp and what mitigation and response steps you took. Okay, so that's all about the event. And then if you made a ransom payment, you paid an extortion demand, that they want to hear about in 24 hours with these same things. Okay, so these are different reports, but the details in each is fairly similar.
And so, hey, go back, because Fred, in the
Yeah.
middle of that, you were shaking your head. Why were you shaking your head?
A couple of places. One of them is type of attack. Well, if you have a ransomware attack, it's probably been combined with a denial of service, an MFA interception, all these things that lead up to a successful attack. It's a chain of things. It's not a singular event. So I'm thinking about this, and maybe it's easier for me to say, hey, we had a ransomware attack. We burned our infrastructure down, rebuilt. Quick, easy, right? Rather than saying we spent a month doing forensics, we figured out it was this chain of particular events. This may be forcing people to take an angle that's going to give them less information than they're actually trying to get. In other words, it's cheaper and faster for me to say, it's a ransomware attack, we burned it down, we rebuilt it. No, investigation done, ransomware, right? I don't know. Is that really going to get them where they want to go? I don't think so.
When you say they, do you mean the federal government or
federal government?
Yeah,
CIRCIA. It's. I know what they're trying to do: get more information, get good detailed information about what happened. Is this incenting people to do that? Probably not. It's incenting probably to do the exact opposite.
I don't know, Mike Borgia. What do you think? Do you think it'll incentivize people properly?
Well, I don't know. I mean, here's where I think it's helpful in the language, at least, is I do think there's good language in these proposed regs, to the extent possible and available and things like that. There are other regulations where it feels impossible because there's just no way we're going to, a lot of the stuff in the EU coming out of this, if you have to be familiar with that, is a lot of we need these 62 items and we need them in 24 hours. And you're like, there's no way, can't be done. But this, I do think there is going to be room for, we don't know. I mean, it's 72 hours in. I don't know. I got a few pieces of data for you. I'm going to throw them your way. Not sure this is a useful exercise, but we're doing it. And then we're going to follow up when we get more information. So yeah, whether it incentivizes people, I don't know, but I think it'll at least give them some comfort that there's going to be some room to kind of wiggle around here a little bit when we inevitably don't know a lot in the first few days.
Interesting too, when they were talking about reporting, there was some, they alluded to the fact that there would be a reporting portal, an online way of filing these reports. And then it said, oh, and you can always send them U.S. postal mail, which I just thought was absurd and funny.
Well, and that was.
I see a lot of humor in federal documents.
I mean, you see a lot of humor in federal documents. We have we have therapists waiting to talk to you. So the but I do think the how you report is going to be interesting. Are there going to be drop down menus of hey, they got it in this way, they got it in that way. Is it going to be a form? Is it going to be, and obviously I guess you can send it in via US mail. You're going to probably miss your deadline. Maybe that's just my neighborhood and the mail. But I mean, do we have a sense, Mike Hamilton, of what, is it going to be a form? Is it going to be, we've seen.
Well, I think it's going to be a form. And I think, so if it was me architecting this and what I wanted to do was collect information in a very consistent way, I would just give you 5 options for answering all of the different questions I wanted answered. Because that way, everybody's answers follow the same pattern, right? I can sort based on things, and if it's very free form information, it makes it until the big AI monster figures it all out, it's kind of hard to compare, across organizations when the reporting is, fundamentally different.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, uh, I think it's going to be really interesting. I also think you're right. Different industries call things different things. Fred and I saw that last week when we were at this healthcare event in Kansas City. Different people are calling things different things. Everybody has a different name, and if you don't create a forum where everybody's calling it the same thing, you're in trouble. And by the way, if you have a smaller organization with one IT director or one IT manager, and they're managing this fire over here and having to report over here, how's that going to work? I mean, that's going to be super difficult, Fred, for somebody with a small IT team.
It's impossible for someone with a small IT team. Frankly, a lot of this stuff. I mean, if you're talking about a small city that's got, one IT person or two, I don't know how this ever gets done, frankly. So hopefully your insurance companies can step in and assist. You might want to ask them how your insurance company is going to deal with this new reporting requirements. They may have some guidance or may even have their own process or plan that they're going to implement.
Well, I think for the smaller organizations, I think one thing that was not addressed anywhere that I saw in the Federal Register was the role of an MSP, right? A managed service provider that does your outsourced IT for your organization, who actually have been, the entry point for a lot of supply chain attacks. They're starting to get pulled into this thing, and now we really need to, I know that there are organizations we work with, for example, Pisces. We work with very, very small entities with 8 employees, right? A small healthcare clinic. They don't have an IT staff. They have a managed service provider. Who is going to need to be read into all of this and be prepared to be able to do this. And I don't know. But let's talk about what happens if you don't do it, if you don't get it done. Long time ago, a friend of mine from the Secret Service, Michael Germain, gave me some statistics that suggested 70% of victims are notified by a third party like the FBI or the Secret Service or CISA. CISA will come to you and say, hey, we found your records online. Here's a thumb drive with the proof. So if you were notified by a third party and you don't report, or if CISA determines that there is traffic coming to or from you that looks like you are compromised and you don't report, if you fail to report something that is reportable, you're going to get a sternly worded letter. All right. That's all I see here. They're going to give you a request for information. And if you neglect to get that done, they can subpoena you. So they can force you to say what happened here if they're willing to expend the resources on something like a very small organization that is not tooled up to do these kinds of things. I don't think it's going to come to that. And, I'm interested in what others think about the ability to enforce any of this.
Yeah, Mike Borja, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that CISA correctly recognizes that this is pretty broad and it's a challenge for a lot of people. I also think what's interesting is this really was, at least I've heard, I don't know, but I've heard rumors that it was kind of a debate within CISA, that some people wanted enforcement authority and some didn't. Some people thought, it's kind of antithetical to who we are and what we do, which is collaborate, coordinate with the private sector if we also have enforcement authority. So at least one read of this is kind of a compromise that there's this very limited enforcement authority, and to cross it, you've really got to basically try, right? You've got to just say, I'm going to ignore them and I'm not going to give them information. And I don't think we're going to see them try to, at this point, push harder. Now, maybe one day, when in a few years, when this is more common, we'll see them push for or receive more power, a bigger hammer to swing. But right now, I don't think so. I think that we're going to see this used for, either one where people truly are bad faith, or, they're going to look and say, hey, there was this major event that hit all these banks, but some of these banks didn't report it. I'm going to go to them and send them an RFI and say, hey, did you do this? Kind of like what the SEC did with SolarWinds, like going around to companies and saying, I think you were affected by SolarWinds, but we never got it. We never saw an 8K from you or anything. What's going on with that? Now, of course, getting a CISA RFI is going to be a lot less scary than getting something from the SEC. But it's a good question, by the way. I just wanted to address for a second about from Bob Keenan. Does this mean I have to report denial of service attacks inflicted by internal accidental telecommunication failures by my transport provider? It's hard to say like what the reaches of the rule are, but the definition of cyber incident means an occurrence that actually jeopardizes without lawful authority. And that's a key term. So I think what they're trying to do here is they're trying to rule out, bring out of scope mistakes, like a bug that causes a crash, something like that. They're looking at, malicious activity. That's what they're trying to get at with that without lawful authority language.
But a mistake that exposes like protected health information. So like people who, have used this, who've accidentally exposed health information because of a pixel in the patient portal. That is, that kind of accident is reportable, but not the other kind.
I don't know. I think this is where the whole thing falls down, frankly, because, CISA is not a regulatory agency. They have to do this through the SSRAs. And they're the ones that have the actual, ability to inflict pain if you are not compliant when they've given you regulatory rules. So, if you're in whatever the water sector, maybe the EPA will fine you or something like that if you're not compliant with this. And that's still, I think, something that they're going to have to work out, right? What does enforcement look like? Because this is not a threat.
I don't think CISA has any intention of enforcement or this being part of an enforcement mechanism. Jake and I heard the field office agent for Kansas City spend an hour with his hands in the air saying, we do not do enforcement. We are not here to make anything, more difficult for your organization. The reason we're here is to help. And I really think at heart, they're trying to help. They're trying to get as much information together, trying to get ahead of the problem. Is this the way to do it? We'll find out.
Yep. Okay, so wrapping up here, what should everybody take away from this? Is there something that anybody should be doing for this? So I would say number one, jump in there, provide comments, ask questions. They give you an email address to ask questions. I will say that while this rulemaking process is going on, the comment period is open. They're being a little closed mouth. They're not being authoritative about anything, saying, well, we're going to have to just get through the question period. Determine whether or not your organization is affected and in what way. If you are a collection of agencies and you have 4 of them that actually are critical infrastructure, is your organization writ large going to need to tool up to make sure that you have the capability to do this reporting and do it on time? Modify your incident response plan because now it's going to include this reporting. So that's definitely going to have to be done. And if there is a web-based reporting form that comes out, probably familiarize yourself with that. There was comment in the chat that this could look like a lot like the IC3 intake form, the Internet's Cyber Complaint Center, and that's probably true. And I would say ensure that you have enough instrumentation specifically monitoring on your network and endpoints in place where you can query things to find out, gather the information that they want reported and do it quickly. I mean, if you're actually going to be compliant with this, clock's ticking and you're going to have to find out what happened here as quickly as possible and then exercise this to see if you're actually going to be able to do it. Now, all of this doesn't happen until 2025. There's a lot of time between now and then. So engage in that comment period and, make your thoughts known.
I'd like to make one comment on number 2 here to determine whether your organization is affected, because there's a point of common confusion already emerging. You look at section 226.2, that's the applicability section, defines who's a covered entity, right? It's got, as we talked about, it says this part applies to an entity in a critical infrastructure sector. So we talked about that with the tree that everyone hated. And we talked about all the confusion about how do you know if you're in the sector? So you got to do that. And then one of 2 things, either you exceed the small business standard and it's a big fat or you meet this laundry list of sector-based criteria, what I've seen people already look at is they've looked at the sector-based criteria and they say, well, I'm not a bank under that, and I'm not a critical care hospital under this, and so I'm good. I'm not covered. It's not what it says. What it literally says is if you are in one of these sectors and you either exceed the small business threshold or you are in one of these, you are covered. So that means two things, at least. One, you are not on the laundry list, but you're in a sector and you're bigger than a small business, you're in. Two, you are a small business, but you're in a sector and you meet one of the laundry list, you are also in. So you're not out just because you're a small business either.
Right. This is confusing.
I think it is confusing and, and complex, and we'll see what happens, in a year, as we do get to the end here, I do want to say a couple of quick housekeeping things, and then we'll go to final thoughts. Number one, at the end of all of our webinars, we give folks a survey. We want to know how we did. Did you like this? Was this good? I know at the beginning, somebody said, we love your webinars. Well, let us know what was good, the bad, the ugly. Let us know. So I put the link to the survey in the chat there. Number two is, this is the part where I say, hey, Critical Insight can do a lot of this preparation for you because you want to know, as we talked about today, like you want to be prepared for this. You want to build a good incident response plan. You want to test it with a tabletop exercise. You want to know when the bad guy gets in. And if you don't have somebody watching the system 24/7, that's something we can do for you. And, you want to have somebody on retainer to do that response. Yes, your insurance company will probably do it, but like who's going to check before your insurance company? And if your insurance company is not going to do it, who do you have? And so we can help with that as well. Okay. So now I'm putting up Mike Hamilton and Mike Borges' email addresses up there. Also, my email address I put in the chat, jake@criticalinsight.com. If you're having trouble looking at that deck or anything that I put in the chat, or you need the video or anything like that, go ahead and shoot me an email. It's just jake@criticalinsight.com. And now we're going to go final thoughts. We're going to go Fred, we're going to go Mike Borgia, and then we're going to give Mike Hamilton the final thought. Fred, go for it.
Okay. Yeah. It's yet another muscle we all need to build. Literally, you need to practice this. You need to develop some text for the templates for these kinds of reporting requirements. So get ahead of it, plan for it. It's something you're going to have to do.
All right. Mike Borgia, final thoughts.
So channel Douglas Adams and say, don't panic. I mean, really, and we always say that, but like, don't, because really like the enforcement is like basically nothing here. Which is not me advising anyone. I'm not giving legal advice at all, obviously, but I'm particularly not giving any legal advice not to care about the law. You should. But understand, yes, this is a hard law. It's a complex law. And normally I don't get to say things like, try your best. And if you screw it up, it's actually okay. Normally it's like, try your best. And if you mess it up, then you'll just get sued and you'll be doing it for the next 6 years. But that's not the case here. So yes, it's frustrating, but it's okay. We'll figure it out. And, this is actually a rare case where there's some room to kind of try to work through this and be a good faith actor and do the right thing, even if you don't get it all right.
Awesome. Mike Hamilton, final thought.
So this is going to be a long time before this is actually baked. And I think it is going to fall onto critical sectors differentially, depending on what you do. So, when they're starting to homogenize all this, harmonize all this, they're going to start with energy, they're going to go with water, they're going to do with the really critical things and get it all worked out. And then eventually it's going to cascade down to, the peripheral kinds of organizations. Still open questions in my mind about local government, and we're just going to have to get through the comment period and get to the final rule before we find out.
Awesome. All right. Well, on behalf of Critical Insight, on behalf of Davis Ray Tremaine and everybody on the panel today, thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciated you having you here. Again, if you need anything, shoot me an email, jake@criticalinsight.com. We appreciate if you take that survey and have a fantastic rest of the week. Bye, everybody.
Yep. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
See you, Michael. See you, Fred. Bye, Jake.
Bye.